Okay, got it. Welcome to episode 129 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. As always, I'm joined by Mary, a woman who mutters useless, useless when she opens the fridge to find all the beer gone. I am merely a discarded, cut-up boot named Darren. Sic semper Tyrannis. Mary, how are we doing?
Good. How are you? That
Oh,
was
doing great.
probably one of
Summer's
the best
hit.
intros you've ever done.
Oh, please. No, it's going well. How are you doing?
Good, good.
Good, good. Well, this will be a fun, action-packed night. We're going to talk about this, but I guess before we kind of get started, I will do my hostel duties. You probably forgotten already, and I'll ask you, what are you drinking? What are you drinking today, Mary?
I'm drinking Mayflower IPA from brewed here in lovely Plymouth, Mass. And
Right.
out of my Chickamauga mug, which has nothing to do with our episode, but it just happened to be the mug I grabbed out of the cupboard, and it's my favorite battle. So,
Okay, well, that's quality. Outstanding.
yeah. And what are you drinking?
Oh, God, thanks for asking. I thought you'd forgotten again, Mary. I'm drinking, it's called Hazy Boy from New England, from Mayflower, I guess, as well. It's good IPA. And I'm drinking it out of my Mary Surratt coffee mug, which I have right here. And I'm drinking it for obvious reasons that we'll talk about it. Mary, I don't know if you know this, okay, but there was a TV show recently on called Manhunt that came out about the James Swanson book. It was on Apple TV, and we watched the entire thing, and it was very interesting. It was some the good, the bad, and the ugly, like everything else. And anytime we're going to talk about John Wilkes Booth or the assassination, we are going to bring in our guest, Dave Taylor, who I don't think anybody's going to doubt this. He's probably one of the top 3 or 4 people on the whole planet when it comes to Lincoln assassination, what he knows. He's someone friend of ours we've talked to in the past. So welcome, Dave Taylor.
Well, hi there. I'm just a sockdologizing old man trap here to see you all.
Well done.
Well, you had the puns. I had to quickly think of something.
Well, that was good, though.
Well done. Yeah. And so, we're going to talk about this episode. But again, Dave, everybody knows Dave. He has a Lincoln Conspirators blog. He's probably one of the more read Lincoln assassination people. He's done presentations at the Lincoln Museum. He used to do the John Wilkes Booth escape tour. He made a sojourn into the Pine Thicket one time. It lasted a couple of days till he ran away. But he lasted.
It's a thunderstorm. Yeah, I didn't last as long as Booth, but I got the experience.
Yeah, so we're going to talk obviously about the TV show Manhunt. And this is one, like a lot of times when the subject of the Lincoln assassination comes up, some people embrace talking about it. Some people want nothing to do with it. There's been a lot of great books about it, and there's been some okay movies about it. But I think we were all pretty excited to find out about this Manhunt TV show. And I think, if we talk really quickly what it's about, it really is just a soup to nuts Lincoln assassination. It starts with the assassination, goes all the way beyond Garrett Farm. It goes into Reconstruction, talks about the Andrew Johnson. But I guess kind of get started with this, David. I know early first impressions about this, without getting into overall details. What was your first thoughts about it?
My initial thoughts as watching is one, I was just blown away by the visual aspects of the entire thing. I thought just from the very beginning how amazingly they did with costuming, with set pieces, and just how it was really what I'd always hoped in terms of seeing this, this huge historical event kind of recreated with modern sets and whatnot. Not that they haven't done a good job, in previous decades and recreating this in different movies and TV shows, but seeing it as we expect to see things now, it was a feast for the eyes. And I was very, the second we started, I thought the introduction of the whole series where you have, looking outside Washington where people are celebrating the end of the war, and suddenly someone slams down the windowsill and you see the initials JWB on Booth's hand, and that's how we're introduced to our villain. It was, the opening shots of the show really set the scene for the amazing technology we have today in order to make everything look almost as it was, with even color toning and shading that they do to make things look older and everything like that. You really got whisked away into Civil War Washington. And so I was blown away by that and was very pleasantly surprised and I was hoping that would be the case, but you never know how far money can go. But my overall take was that this is what the story has needed in terms of visuals and really to make it connect with a modern audience. And I felt that throughout the whole thing, even though some people disagreed with certain characters' appearances. and their physical attributes being a little different from the historical people, I still thought with that and the acting across the whole series, really, I thought made this whole event come to life in a way that I haven't really seen before that seemed believable and realistic. So I thought I was always impressed by that.
I
I
thought
felt
like I'm gonna say this real quick to your point. When that first scene came with the window and they had the
mhm.
tattoo on the right hand, the left hand, the correct hand, I'm like, oh, we're in for this now. This is going to be legit. And it kind of goes off. I don't want to interrupt you, Mary.
I felt the same way. Like it's something that I've kind of been waiting for as a kid because that's what got me hooked into studying the Civil War. And I mean, we'd had Killing Lincoln in, I think it was 2013, which was amazing 90-minute documentary, not connected at all with that book of the same title, done by National Geographic, narrated by Tom Hanks, which was amazing. It was so good. And I've watched it countless times since. And it just like, like you said, Dave, the costumes, just the visuals, all of that, it starts to pull you in right from the beginning. And that's when I'm like, wow, this is great. And I mean, the thing that I, had to keep in mind going into it is this is historical fiction based on James Swanson's Manhunt, as Darren said. And that's the thing. And that's when I was like, okay, so what historical liberties are they going to take with this? How far are they going to go? I always had that in the back of my mind. And yes, you make reference to the facial hair. I don't think there's been this much outrage over facial hair since the movie Gettysburg
That's
in
true.
1993.
And let the record show, Dave and I both have beards right now, so people can't come on us. But I mean, I thought, again, it does everything you said spot on because the lighting was right. They had that, it was like a dark feel to it. It really caught the overall early part of the assassination of what was going on. And my big picture thing with this, before we get into the details, was I started to watch this, and like you, Davey, I'm watching this with a critical eye. You can't help not. And you find yourself getting more and more and more cringing as it goes over certain things that we're going to talk about. But then I had an epiphany. Something hit me. And I said, something? A couple weeks ago, Mary and I were at a meeting, and we were talking to an astronaut who was flying off into space this weekend. And I asked her, I said, you're an astronaut. You've been up in space. And I said, what do you think of like Star Wars and Star Trek? Because it's not right. She goes, oh, I love that. You kidding me? Because I don't think about it. I just enjoy it. And when I hit that point with Manhunt, when I said, something, this is not to teach anybody what happened. All this is to provide entertainment around a historical thing. And once I realized that I kind of could let go from the true facts history and just took it for the entertainment it was, I enjoyed it. It clicked in. Like 3 or 4 episodes in is when it clicked in for me.
Yeah, and I took longer to learn that lesson, I'll admit it, because as you said, and truthfully, historians were the worst audience because we want everything to be right, but that is not reasonable at all. Like no production is ever going to be able to make everything, and even our interpretation of what is right is constantly changing. That's the nature of studying history. And so we are terrible, really, for these types of things because there is the part of you that's just nitpicky, because you know this thing and this thing is wrong, and oh, I
So
wish
in
it was
episode
right.
1, did you say it didn't say diary on the front tab of the
I
diary?
absolutely did. That's like my first critique, where everything is beautiful. They're panning over. Boots got his things, and the diary says diary on the front. I'm like, I even turned to my wife, and I'm like, it didn't say diary. And she's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, never mind. And I had to stop.
It didn't say diary. But then
No.
at that point, I mean, they have to tell the audience that it's a diary, and everyone who studies this knows what it is. But if you don't know it, but then they started to make some mistakes with the characters. And in the one who I really felt bad about, I guess the phrase would be like creative license, right? Is that what I think they use?
Yes.
It is Edwin Spangler. And the thing about Spangler, and his character is one that was played well by a guy named Walker Babington, I guess his name is. I've really heard of him. But in the episode, it really doesn't tell the true narrative of what happened with him. And so when you take a peek at it, it's almost everything related to Spangler it's a fiction. It just is. And what he basically did was that situation where he's literally taking the horse, handing it over to Peanut Burrows, and everything goes from there. And then the whole thing with the interrogation with Burrows, with Stanton, it just I've learned quickly on with this that it was going to be a situation where where it was going to be basically the Tobias Menzies character of Edwin Stanton was going to be a combination of Jessica Fletcher, in Columbo.
Oh, he's like Gil Grissom too on CSI in some
Yes.
ways.
Yeah,
That's how I saw him, as Gil Grissom.
Where he's sitting there, and in that scene later on when he measures the shoe in the window, and he's I mean, I'm like, oh my god. But I mean, it just little things like that were something, because if you look at the history, it's so easy to, I shouldn't say easy, but there's so many accounts of guys, Manhunt, for example, the book, Swan's book, obviously Michael Kaufman's book, American Brewers, which I think is by far the best book on any of this stuff. There's so many resources that could have been a lot more accurate. And just because they could take the license doesn't mean they had to, right?
Yeah, I look at it very quickly. And we already knew that Stanton was going to play an oversized role in this compared to his actual involvement in the manhunt. That's not to say, Secretary of War Stanton wasn't involved. He was, helping to coordinate the different detectives and the groups that are out there. But he, the real one, stays in Washington and is attending cabinet meetings and still dealing with the end of the Civil War because it's not over. And so he is more managerial level, while he has special commissioners who are organizing the actual search and doing all the big stuff. Yeah, his name's on certain things, and immediately after Lincoln is shot, his activities at the Peterson house are vital to keeping the country going and sending out those first few soldiers out looking for Booth and closing down the city and everything. So he is vital then. But once Lincoln is dead, Stanton is not ever boots on the ground. But this show, it is a Stanton show. It may say Manhunt, but it might as well have just been called Stanton. And that's fine. Like, he is a compelling historical figure who for far too long has been maligned, especially by conspiracy theorists who have tried to associate him with the death of Lincoln as if he was involved with it. So I was happy to see Stanton, kind of be portrayed, I think more accurately in terms of, like, he was very good at his job. He was a very good war secretary, and, the difficult choices he and Lincoln both had to make during the Civil War period, which were told beautifully in flashbacks. Lincoln, of course, it's hard to tell the story and have an actor being Lincoln if you kill him in the first episode and then we never see him again. But I thought I appreciated how we would flash back to see the relationship between Lincoln and Stanton as the Civil War continued. And so I was okay with the fact that it was definitely a Stanton show, but initially there was disappointment because they called it Manhunt. And really, as the show goes on, it is less about the actual manhunt and very less about Booth than it is more about Stanton and a more fictional attempt to not only figure out where Booth is and who is responsible for Booth's actions, but also his fight for Reconstruction, which again is a wonderful story to tell, and I'm glad they told it. But going in thinking this is going to be the book Manhunt put on screen, there was a sense of disappointment because that's not what the end result actually is.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting it to be as much about Stanton, because Stanton, to me, I mean, yes, he's a micromanager, and they took that to like the next level in this. And I have to say, like, I'm not a huge fan of Stanton when it comes to members of Lincoln's cabinet, but I came to respect him more from this because you see what he's doing. You see his, through those flashbacks that you mentioned, the relationship he has with Lincoln, how close he is, and how much he wants to solve this case. But he's like, he's like Gil Grissom. Like, he's on the ground
with a teleporter. He gets to
Yeah.
places so quickly. He's got
I
a
know he's in
transporter from
like
Star Trek.
Quebec. Like, I'm
Yeah,
like,
obviously,
how did you get to Quebec so quickly? And
Yeah.
like I was like I took a forensic anthropology course in university like 20 years ago. I remember the first thing my instructor told us was that and you watch CSI, and like we all raised our hands, and she's like, none of you are going to be Gil Grissom. This is not, and she completely like, so like what Gil Grissom does is not like an actual, you're not on the ground collecting the evidence. It's like, it's so different than how it is in real life. But I think I get why they had to do this in this show. Like, they're putting a few different characters, I think, into Stanton to kind of lessen what they have. Like, I guess, I don't know, make their job easier with writing, but also to make him the character. And I agree with you. It's like, it would have been nice to have been something about Stanton instead of Manhunt.
Yeah, and then it flashes right after the scene. It flashes to the Seward attack, and I thought that it was interesting that they showed it from Davy's perspective from the street, because it add a little bit of power to it. And they show Powell knock on the door. William Bell answers the door. He goes upstairs. Hilarity ensues. Everything goes from there. But I mean, this is one of those things I was thinking about when I was reading the book, was how they could have got this so right. And one of the biggest misconceptions with the Lincoln assassination was that Seward had a neck brace on, right? And you read that, and it's not just this. You read that in most places. And so I'm watching it going, I wonder if Swanson did this. I wonder if he's going to do it. They show him. He's got one of those big dog cone shame things on where the dog can't lick himself. That's what he's wearing. And I'm like, oh my God. And so again, it's a little thing that is historical memory. Most people assume, you hear the story, he got the carriage accident, he had the neck brace, and that's why he was saved. And I thought it was an opportunity where they could have got away from that. But again, little things like that are what I picked up specifically about that scene. I mean, there's a lot of other things that weren't too right about it as well, but it's the neck brace that sticks in my mind because how ludicrous it looked, first of all.
But I think but you point out a good thing, Darren. Like I saw that too, and I said the same thing. I'm like, well, he wasn't wearing a neck brace. But even my wife, who is pretty well versed on it because she lives with me, was just like, oh, I thought he did have one because it is in so many places, and because of it's because he did get the neck brace after, after Powell did what he did, they did have to give him a more, stiff neck brace to help protect from his jaw and everything. He did have a very unique thing to help set where he was cut, and so the miscommunication historically is people having seen that after the attack and thinking he had it before, and just these ideas, like you said, the historical memory, which doesn't line up with historical facts in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of historical memory, and the other note I have from this is, as soon as everything goes down and everybody says, "Oh, it was John Wilkes Booth," suddenly people forget how big of an actor he really was, and he turned into basically Casey Affleck instead of Ben Affleck, and Billy Baldwin instead of Alec Baldwin.
Yep.
And I think, again, that goes back to where the perception was that he was like Jack Tripper from Three's Company. He fell and tripped on his face. Everyone got a laugh, but the real actor was his brother, Edwin. And I think that was a real disservice to Booth here. I thought that they really minimized him historically in his role in acting. And I hear that a lot, admittedly, all the time. People say, what do you think? What do you name a modern actor who would have killed Lincoln? And I mean, killed the president. And the people that always come back to is someone like Robert De Niro or Leo DiCaprio or something like that. But people will sit there and say, well, just picture if Robert De Niro had a really crappy acting brother. That's who Booth was. And that's the thing that always kind of got me a little bit. In this episode, I mean, in this series, not only did they really push that narrative, but they turn his brother into an asshole. Like yeah. He's one of these guys where, go fetch me my coffee, Wilkes. I'm going to sit here. There's that scene towards the end when the girl asks for his autograph, and the girl, not you, him. And he's like, ha, ha, ha. And anyone who studies the Booth family, you read Asia's Diary, you read whatever you want to read, you realize how supportive Edwin Booth was for him. And they had their political differences, and they had their political fights. But November 25th, they have the Winter Garden while the buildings are burning around them. And I think they really missed the boat with that. There was an opportunity that they let go.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. Like that was in the first episode, they definitely denigrate Wilkes's acting ability, which I expected though. And that's the thing. He is the villain in the story. And so there are things that are truthful, but aren't what people want to hear. Like, they don't want to hear that Wilkes was an extremely talented actor. He was at his peak at the time, like that he killed Lincoln. And was Edwin also? Yes. And Edwin maybe a little bit above, only because Edwin started earlier and was still acting while Booth gave it up in order to plot against Lincoln. And they, ran a different circle. So there was there were different levels of talent between them, but it in no way was as massive as like a Billy Baldwin compared to Alec Baldwin or something like that, where you're like, or someone who doesn't really know how to act. And so, but this is very typical because it is, and it makes sense. I mean, we don't, but I know there's a lot of actors who, after Booth did what he did, there was, people who would denigrate his abilities, and some actors who would speak up and be like, well, he was a wretched man for what he did, but he was never a wretched actor. He was among the best we had. And that was truthful. You couldn't be a starring actor like Wilkes was and travel the country if you were bad. And he wasn't, it wasn't even like, you know, the comedians were the ones who were lower tier because, oh, you're just
Right.
doing comedy. He is a lead dramatic actor. Like, he is doing Shakespeare. He is respected in his craft. And I think a lot of it is because of what happened and the impact it had on Edwin, and how he forever lived in the shadow of his brother's crime and yet still managed to become even more popular in his old age as the greatest Hamlet and one of the greatest actors of generation. It's easy to look at Edwin at the end of his life and then look at Wilkes when he died and see, well, yeah, obviously Edwin was the far superior actor. But in 1865, Edwin had a few years above Wilkes and was being celebrated in New York. But Wilkes was his equal, and Edwin, as you
Yeah.
said, wrote in his own letters about how proud he was of his brother. And yeah, a few rough edges, but he said the Booth name is more of a hydra now than it ever was. That he's so
Right.
happy that, including his older brother, who admittedly was not as good as the other two, he still was very supportive. And I agree, they made Edwin almost responsible. I mean, there's the
Right.
one scene where he is just trashing Wilkes, and you almost come away being like, oh, is this why Wilkes does it? Because he hates his brother, and the way his brother makes him feel is the one time that the series surprisingly makes Wilkes the sympathetic character
Yeah.
is compared to his brother.
And they made it look like he had daddy issues too with the whole
Oh, yes,
useless thing.
exactly.
I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
but you know, I'd be sympathetic of Booth, but I think you make a good point, Dave, is that people tend to paint with a broad brush with this. And for all the horrific things that Booth did on April 14th that took him to his April 26th, it's just not historically right to say he was a bad actor. And they had those scenes where Edwin's like, well, I'll be in Philly and Boston, New York, and you can be in the South. Like, he had some automatic pass to go over the Confederate lines on the hell he want. I mean, there are little things like that as a historian, like a Civil War guy, you just facepalm. But again, it
Yep.
goes with it. I mean, there are some little things with this first episode. We're not going to go through all 7 like this beer all night, but this is where most of the big stuff is in the first few episodes anyway.
Yeah, this is
Was
where it
the
pulls the person in.
right,
And the other thing too with Wilkes is they have this meeting with him and Parker in the Star Saloon
right,
that didn't actually happen, but it's one of those moments that kind of sticks with you in it, where they set up who John Wilkes Booth is and all that.
well,
And I mean,
yeah,
I've been
it,
asked too, like, who is John Wilkes Booth? Like, if it were had to happen today, and I have responded Leonardo DiCaprio, and people are like,
yeah.
no, but he must have been bad. I'm like, no, he was a big time actor in his
But
time.
but you mentioned John Parker though. Of course, you talk to people and they'll say, well, you know, if John Parker was at a station, Lincoln would still be alive today. He would say things like that. And you have to understand the Secret Service was not the same back then.
No,
And there's also a guy named Charles Forbes sitting right at the desk. If if John if Parker was sitting right there, he's famous, he's gonna give him his calling card too, and they're all gonna walk in. Um, and so they make John Park look out to be bad. And I don't think Forbes was even in the episode at
he's
all. I
not.
don't remember him being
No,
in it. So again, it looks like there were so many Keystone Cops, a comedy of errors that kind of went with that. I thought, and it's unfortunate, but I guess it's not unexpected.
Yeah, they I think they wanted to tell the story as people kind of expect it to be. And as we said, historical memory isn't always the same. But yes, the idea of blaming John Parker for Lincoln's assassination, which you could complain that Parker wasn't hanging around near Abe, but at the same time, there was the coachman or the footman, Charles Forbes, like you said, who was sitting in front of the box and let Booth in anyway, because why wouldn't you? This is a time, and that is the hardest disconnect for a modern audience, you know, like to be like, why wasn't he guarded? Or I even had someone comment about there's conspiracies about the vice president, Andrew Johnson, and about how Booth sent his lady of the night to Johnson that night in order to make sure the door was open. And I'd be like, well, no. And when I pointed out, I'm like, well, why would they do that? But to make sure the door was unlocked or open. I'm like, what would stop Atzerodt from just knocking on the door and Andrew Johnson opening it? And they're like, well, that wouldn't happen because he's the vice president. I'm like, it absolutely would happen. He was just staying in a hotel, and there's no reason not to answer a knocked door. It's not like today where we have the Ring camera and we're like, I'm not going to answer the door.
yeah,
You
that's
just
not a
did
good
it.
person.
No,
Yeah,
no.
you just did it.
Nowadays, doorbell rings and no one goes near the door
Yeah,
nowadays.
we all just hide and pretend
Who
we're
the
not
hell is
home.
that?
No, we're not
You know,
home. I was gonna say
but
the other thing with historical memory with this first episode too is the death of President Lincoln, and they actually have Stanton say angels and not ages. And I personally was shocked by that I was
Yeah.
like, whoa, okay,
Well, it's in
we're
Swanson. I will
going.
say that's one of the times they actually followed Swanson's book. Swanson is one of the
Yes.
few modern authors who actually puts Now He Belongs to the Angels. But really, he has no justification for it. And there's some great research that was done. It was a few years ago when one of our virtual Surratt conferences, Scott Schrader, who's a Lincoln historian, who he really went through the history of who said what and when. Now, the most likely explanation is Stanton probably said nothing when Lincoln died, because it wasn't until John Hay did it like 30 years after Lincoln's death, the first time he says angels, and then it kind of, I'm sorry, ages, and then it is what's what populates around. But it like most likely Stanton had no very deep thoughts at that moment. He was just in grief like everyone else. But personally, I'm like, if you're gonna have him say anything, you got to give it to the earliest account that we have, and that would be Now He Belongs to the Ages. There's a reason
Yep.
it's engraved above
Right.
Lincoln's tomb, and Swanson just likes angels better because in his mind the Christian background of Stanton and stuff like that. I'm like, yeah, I'm not saying that that's not true, but at the same time we don't have any good scholarship for it. The provenance of that phrase is bad anyway. So, but at least I mean they're following what that's the one few time where they follow what
Yes.
Swanson says, even though I disagree with that choice.
And there's a lot of stuff. There's all there's the James Tanner stories. There's all kinds of stuff that goes on about that. The paraplegic from Shiloh got his legs knocked off, the stenographer, and one of the stories talks about how his pencil broke and he couldn't write anymore, and people try to remember what they wrote. But again, I think as when you die on Good Friday and you're a popular president, as time goes on, you're going to be deified. And so I think that quote. I think personally, the second Lincoln dies, Stanton's out the door trying to figure out where Johnson, what's going on. I don't know if he's waxing poetic, but we'll never know. That's how we study history, though, right? Because you never know. Maybe he did.
Exactly.
Maybe that's where the dance number could have come in right there.
Yeah, exactly.
Would have lightened the mood a little bit, probably, right? But I think we're going to talk about the thing that got me the most, and the one issue that I probably would have concussed myself with the face palming, was the Navy crossing the bridge. And I thought this was a gigantic missed opportunity because, you talk about with Silas Cobb and have that conversation, everything's going good. But the complete disregard for John Fletcher here. Because the thing about it is, when you take John Fletcher, certainly with the nailers tables and every stables, they could have tagged them all together right there. And without telling the John Fletcher story about the different horses, none of it makes sense at that point, right? And I think historically they could have done that. They didn't mention TB Road, though, so I'll give them credit for that.
Yeah, thank gosh.
That was, I was fully expecting, speaking a little bit of fineness to jump in here, right? But I just thought that was the big miss on that, was with Davy and the horses, in that whole thing, because I thought that if you're really studying this, it kind of explains, because how are you going to connect Harold later to Surratt and all that stuff without introducing who John Fletcher was?
I think and it was very clear. And there's times where they needed to make changes to fit everything, even though it's a 7-hour miniseries. That's still not enough time to tell the story. As you know, I give as I said when it started, I give a 12-hour booth tour of the escape. It takes 12 hours, and even then, I don't get to everything. Like I do his escape, but it's never enough time for all the details. So I don't fault the series for finding ways where they can just bend it just to make it convenient, and you have to. And so the way they did it is sometimes less than ideal. So what they have is the same day they have Atzerodt getting arrested and apparently ratting on everyone and putting all the names together. It's a lot more convenient than actually, John Fletcher. He was the stableman who rented Davy a horse, and Davy surrenders with George Atzerodt, and somebody says John Surratt's name. It's complicated, and it's just easier for this production to say, these are the names. And they also know Lewis Powell's name from the beginning. I mean, they shouldn't know his name. No one, he's alias Payne for a reason. No one knows his name until the trial, when he finally lets up who he is to his own defense attorney. And that's near the end of the trial. So no one should know who he is, but it's just, I understand the need for the convenience, but it shows how the series was, when it was changing focus to be Stanton, that the Manhunt and these aspects related to Booth and his conspirators had to be sidelined. Mary Surratt gets practically nothing, in the whole thing, which was surprising, given how controversial she is as a figure. They gave Mudd much more screen time than they did Mary, but even then, it's brief and it's just for Mudd, just to establish that he a bad man, which, I mean, he is, so I get it.
He's a very bad, yes.
No.
But and it was interesting so much for me is that, I am one who I don't really pull punches when it comes to Dr. Mudd and my impression of how much he knew, and especially when Booth showed up. Like, I'm one who will tell you that I think he knew about the assassination. I think he learned of the assassination and then didn't turn Booth in purposefully because he was in trouble. But this series goes farther than even I would. It's the complete antithesis of the innocent country doctor. It is he was well aware of what was going on and helped Booth in his escape, like told him where to go. And that is just as much historically inaccurate as innocent country doctor who knows nothing. And so it's interesting to see how they just completely did the opposite of Prisoner of Shark Island, and we're just like, he is so into it, he knows everything about it, and he's covering everything up. And it was just interesting to see that dynamic change. And I don't know how well the Mudd descendants are dealing with it.
No,
apparently not well, from
I wouldn't think so.
that I've heard. But I mean, I've always been a person that has, like, my opinion's always been like, okay, Mudd knew stuff. He's not innocent. But yeah, as you said, like this, I was like, whoa, this is going completely, like, wow. And I mean, Mudd is not a great person. Like,
Right.
he's racist, all that other stuff. And I did enjoy the portrayal of him. I think they did a pretty good job, but like
Matt Walsh was great. I kept expecting him call somebody Jonah, though. That was the only problem watching that. If you've seen Veep, one of the greatest shows of all time.
Gotcha.
But no, I again, yeah, the Mudd thing was interesting. I mean, obviously, we'll talk about Mary Sims here in a little bit, and that the timing's wrong with a lot of that. But out of the timing stuff, I didn't mind. To your point, Dave, they had to get this into 7 series. Yep. I don't mind the fact that Atzerodt was arrested in 5 seconds, because you can't tell him the whole story of him skipping out in the hotel and going up to Germantown because you can't. But when they did finally escape, and this is the thing, and this is selling your side of the street now, Dave, is the Booth escape tour. I think they went pretty quickly from the Navy Bridge to Mudd's house and kind of missed a stop somewhere in the middle, which is a pretty important piece,
Yes, and that exactly. When I first saw it, I'm like, we skipped the boarding house entirely. Well, I mean, not the boarding house. We skipped the Surratt Tavern entirely. Right. But then we go back there, where Stanton, when he's out in the field, he rides to the tavern, which they've not established as a place other than being owned by Mary Surratt, and he is busting down fake walls and finding a secret room with messages from Jefferson Davis. And that's when we really went to, we're just in a fantasy now, a very entertaining historical fantasy. Yep. I was like, so we're not going to actually use the tavern for what it was actually used for on the escape. We're just doesn't exist in that, but it does exist as this very top secret line directly to Richmond. Okay.
And so they, and then we could think about Mary Surratt here now. Was, one of the biggest pieces of this whole puzzle is the shooting irons and the field glasses. I mean, anybody who studies high school assassination, those phrases because of what happened. They blew through that, but then so it seems like, okay, they try not to implicate Mary in the series, but then earlier in the episode, they completely blow the arrest scene. And the thing about the arrest scene, and most people think that Mary Surratt probably had some kind of cancer, or she had some physical malady that was affecting her body. And when they arrested him, it was the middle of the night in real life. It looked like they arrested him at lunchtime. Yes. And so when she says, by God, I've never seen this man in my life, it makes sense when you put in the context that she can't see well. The gas lights are down, it's night, and he doesn't have a bag, his pants over his head like in the TV show. He still has a hat. But they really missed that scene because the Surratt people, okay, and I got my mug right here, so I'll say it, is that's what you hang your hat on, because the reality is it's very likely she may not have recognized it at that very moment. She definitely met Powell before, but they made it sound like she was obviously lying. but then they completely missed the Surratt tavern scene down there in Clinton, which was just weird to me, you know?
Yeah, the fact that it almost seems at that point like why even have Louis Weichman as a character in this? Because
Hmm.
if Mary is going to be so secondary, which I understand, you want it if it's going to be the Stanton show and then Booth and Lincoln, the flashback scenes, then okay, you minimize the conspirators as much as possible. Except I will say I was very pleasantly surprised at how much of a role David Harold had. I thought the actor who did him was great, and
Yep.
that this is the first time that Davey has really had character development and scenes. So he is represented well. But the other conspirators, fine. There are too many of them. They cut out the Sam Arnold and Michael O'Loughlin, the ones who were involved in the abduction plot. There is no discussion of the abduction plot against Lincoln. They just pretended it didn't exist and they didn't
Yep.
include them in the arrest or the trial. So they had to make cuts. But it was interesting. So if you're going to have Weichman, though, who becomes a pretty good secondary character in these first few episodes and then later at the trial, why bother if you're making Mary so cut and dry? Like you
Right.
have it, she has Powell staying there, and then when he's punching Eckert, she bolts. Like nothing is more guilty than running away. And Weichman pulls a gun on her and it's like, don't move. And it's like, okay, then if you're going to change the characters so much and make them not important, then it was interesting some of the choices they made of these secondary roles. Like Weichman doesn't matter anymore. We don't need him to testify about Booth being around. The lady just ran off while like the
Yep.
Powell dude, who even at the very beginning, they mess it up and they have Powell staying at the boarding house the day of the assassination. As if, and she dresses him and it gives him that maniacal look. In the first few scenes, Powell is just eating breakfast. Davy or Atzerat, I forget who now, comes to get him, and Mary puts Powell's jacket on him and just like watches him leave. At that point in the very beginning, I was like, oh, is that John Surratt? I didn't even know it was Powell until a few
Yep.
scenes later, he's stabbing everyone at Seward's. So it's like, if you're gonna make her evil from the get-go or make her guilty from the second before you even know her name, why bother building these other characters like Weichman?
Yep.
Why not use that time for other more
Yeah.
important people?
And then not use the number one piece of evidence they used against her, really.
Mhm.
It down there in Clinton. And it just it, again, you're nitpicking with this stuff, but that's a big one. I thought that was a big miss. That and the Fletcher one, I thought in the early few episodes where I thought were the ones they really could have made it a lot better. Now, obviously, they're gonna get to the mud house. This is where the Mary Sims timeline thing goes off the hill again.
Yeah,
You
because
know, she
she's
was
not, her and her brother are not employed by Mud by the time that Wilkes gets there, right? Like they're not
Correct.
part
And
of
that
that.
and we knew that going in from all the advertisements when they're like, okay, Tobias Menzies is going to be Edwin Stanton and the other, Booth, Harold, Mary Lincoln, stuff like that. And then we're like, oh, and then Lovey Simone, I believe is the actress's name, is
Yes.
Mary
Yep.
Sims. So we knew months going in that Mary Sims is going to have an oversized role in this series compared to her real thing. And I had prepared like my audience, whatever, to be like, Mary Sims was not at the Mud Farm during the escape. She had been enslaved by the Muds, and then when slavery was ended in Maryland in November of 1864, she left, and she was not there, and she never goes back. We don't know where she goes. She is one of the many African American figures who unfortunately
Mhm.
disappear. And I know I saw some New Yorker article be like, "Oh, but she's living in Charles County in the 1870 census." Well, I don't know if that's the same one. Mary Sims is
Yeah.
not the most, unique name. And yes, there is an African American woman named Mary Sims who is still living in Charles County in 1870 census. I don't know if that's her. I can
Hmm.
track Milo Sims, her brother, who was
Yep.
there, and he is in DC in the 1870s as a junk dealer, but I don't know where Mary is. And so, but I understand, there were African American servants, paid servants who were working for Mudd when Booth and Harold arrived there. And I think just for the ease of the user, they decided to kind of combine their stories together into Mary Sims, which I wish they could have instead used the two young girls who actually fed Booth breakfast and whatnot that actually happened, or I think it was Baptist Washington who took their horses at the mud
Hmm.
farm and like could speak to that. I wish they would have included more, but I understand merging them together would be easier. But then and I understand too that it is adding more representation, which the story needs. Like, truthfully, I'm glad that they did a good job. Some of my favorite scenes were the ones in which you have Stanton advocating for African Americans after the war
Mhm.
and Reconstruction, and the fight between him and Johnson. My surprise fate, like I had two surprise characters that I kind of walked away being like, these are really good, and they were the man who played Andrew Johnson, and
Mhm.
just they really did a good job of Yeah, making him as terrible as he
Yep.
was, even though as
Mhm.
much the timeline was he's being way too evil too quickly compared to the real Johnson, but overall it's
Right.
good. And I thought that those scenes where they're discussing, suffrage and like, what is the circumstances going to be for Black Americans now if we don't follow through on this, that was good and the story that needed to be told. But again, it was my hope. Again, I expected Manhunt in which those stories really wouldn't be told because that doesn't isn't involved in this. But Mary Sims as a character was compelling, but as you said, is largely imaginary and is used as a tool to tell the experience of Black Americans, which is
Hmm.
important, but not exactly Manhunt.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, 1864, obviously slavery is abolished in Maryland. So there's a million different things we've talked about. But again, when you look at that episode in the scene at the mud house, for me was a comedy of errors. It was. They even had the wrong leg broken, which, okay, fine. You know what? You got to be really paying attention. Notice that. Did you notice he got the newspaper saying Lincoln was killed already? Did you notice
Yeah.
that?
I mean, they have just the hot off the press, and it was an imaginary
I was like,
newspaper.
wow.
Imaginary newspaper from Bryantown, the small little village that definitely did not have their own newspaper.
Oh yeah,
And yeah.
all voted Lincoln shot, Lincoln dead. I mean, it just and again, I kept telling myself, Darren, don't go crazy with the timelines because that's going to drive you crazy because they
We
have
were
to
both
jam it
sitting
all
there
in.
watching it together, and like at different times we'd be like, oh my God, what is happening? Like what? Like, and then
It
we had
gets
to remember
confusing
it's
because it's
historical
different.
fiction.
They're
Yes.
also at different in the first two episodes. I know I wrote for one of my reviews to be like, you need to know that at the end of episode two, the three main people we're looking at, Stanton, Booth, and oh, I remember the other one. I'm like, they're all on a different timeline. Like, no
Yep.
one is on the same day. It looks like they are, but they're not because they have to.
Yeah.
And I understand you got to condense a 12-day manhunt, and they definitely condense. But then they take a lot of historical liberties so that Stanton can be everywhere.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I would have liked to see Letty and Louisa. Admittedly, I thought that would have been kind of cool. The other scene that was funny was when Mary's shaving Booth with the straight, and that was the racism aspect. But you could tell those scenes weren't lining up right because the shaving cream was there, then it was gone, then it was there, and it was gone. But it's an interesting story, and they really let a lot of that go. But again, it's just one of those things. But you know, he goes off and he's going to escape, and it's that's really when everything kind of goes. And I thought they did a halfway decent job for the most part. Going through Zakaya, going to the pine thicket. Some of the characters we talked before, like Swan, I thought they really did a disservice to him. I thought after Spangler that he was the one I thought they really did dirty as far as his reputation. So if I was his family member, I don't think I would like that too much at all.
Yeah, I called that out as well. I said for a show that did a really good job of representation, especially with the Black voices and the Black experience and the witnesses who were around when this happened. Which I'm going to back up to what they did a really good job was during those scenes where you are seeing Lincoln's casket being taken out of Pearson House and the march through Washington. We have newspaper articles that said the majority of the or vast majority of the mourners were Black who
Hmm.
were openly weeping and whatnot, and they presented that amazingly. And so for a series that did such a good job at, representing Black Americans, I really thought they did a disservice to Oswell Swan, who was a triracial individual who lived in the backwoods of Charles County, was a tobacco farmer with 8 children, who had no knowledge of Booth and Harold, who they were, when he innocently took them from near Dr. Mudd's house to Rich Hill. He didn't know who they were, what they had done. He had heard about the assassination, but didn't know any details, like everyone else. And so he took them there. They paid him. He went home. And once he figured out that the men responsible for Lincoln's death might have a broken leg, he went right to the authorities and told them exactly
Hmm.
the two men he had taken and what had happened. And so the fact that they make him seem like he is a person who has survived the war by willingly smuggling Confederates, across the Union lines and helping them and being like, hey, money is money, was quite a disservice. And, not to say that people like that didn't exist. I'm sure there were. And I'm sure there were even people in the Black community who were helping to certain degrees or just
Hmm.
looking the other way while Confederate things were going on, probably because of being scared for their own safety in these white neighborhoods, that what can they say? What can they do to stop it if they want to keep living where they live? But there's no justification for that when it comes to Swan, a man who then went to prison. Like, he was in prison like everyone else for a month, and an attempt was made to even get him reward money, and it was turned down, which they did kind of bring in the show where he kind of said, I'm not going to get reward money anyway, so I might as well help you. But I do feel like that was a misstep in a show that otherwise was very positive in terms of representation of Black Americans.
And then meanwhile, on the Union side, Stanton is getting some serious airline miles that day after the assassination.
He's going to Quebec. How does he get to
Well,
Quebec?
just even before that, even before in Maryland, I mean, this is a dude who, he ends up in Washington, he goes down to Maryland. I mean, he gets everywhere. I mean, but again, to Dave's point, he's the hero here. So he's Batman.
Mhm.
That's who he's going to be. He's going to be every place where a guy like maybe a Thomas Eckert was, they're going to replace him with Stanton, because he's going to be, it's the good versus evil, the whole thing. It's like more the fugitive than the Manhunt is really what it is.
Yeah.
But I definitely got a kick out of that as well. But
yeah, Mary,
guess...
I thought of you when Stanton, so before he goes to Quebec, he tells his servant, he's like, book me a room at the hotel in Quebec. And I'm like, how is he going to do that? There's no internet, no phone. How is this servant in DC just going to book your room? I mean, he's going to use the military telegraph to send. I'm like, yeah, it made me laugh.
That's what I thought too. And then he shows up in Quebec at one point. I'm like, he wasn't there. What's going on? And just the way, like, I mean, I do like that Canada was mentioned in this, because they were very much a Confederate like hotbed, especially
Absolutely.
in Quebec. Like, we're not innocent in this at all. And I like that part, because it's not a thing to teach that in Canadian history, unfortunately. And I think it's something that should be taught, that we were involved in the Civil War in many ways, not just, soldiers fighting for the Union, there was some that fought for the Confederacy, but there was also this in Montreal, where like this kind of hotbed that's happening. And I do like that they did focus on that, because it kind of brought that to light as well. I have to say, though, about the guy that played Stanton, I really did like him, despite the fact that people were not happy he didn't have a beard. I got over that pretty quickly when I realized, like, okay, this guy is playing who Stanton was. And also it's just a beard.
Right.
I'm not I wasn't I'm not going to get upset about that.
The constellation Orion doesn't look like Orion at all, right? It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
But I mean, he obviously needed help booking the hotel in Quebec, because he was too busy banning feed in the entire state of Maryland.
Oh, he's going all over the place.
So he can't do everything, Mary.
That was so silly to me. No horses in Maryland can be fed because Lincoln has been shot.
You can't do that, dude.
What does that mean? But then Davy's got his little push cart, and then he sees the sign. He's like, "Oh no!" And he turns around, so it's effective.
So he must use that same social media page to get that out there too, because everybody in the state of Maryland, the fact that a lot of these places are probably 2 weeks behind. They get the memo already. I saw that in the scene when he walks up to the sign and sees it. It was like that scene in Blazing Saddles. They go to the toll booth in the desert. Oh man, we got to get a shitload of dimes. That's right. That's all I could think about was that scene right there. I'm like, that's exactly what this scene is.
Yeah, it was so strange to me. And I enjoyed that they went up to Montreal. They mentioned Montreal, but then that's unfortunately when it goes off, because then we go to conspiracy theory territory where people who don't know, who watch, and I'm okay with, all right, people who watch the show might think Spangler's a little more guilty than he is. That's a disservice to him, but okay, fine. It's a minor thing. But this series really went hard to really take the assassination out of Booth's hand. Now, I will admit, at the end, Stanton cannot prove his grand conspiracy theory that involves George Sanders, but Sanders is such a huge character in the middle part of this series. Yeah. Anyone who walks away from it will be like, well, apparently it was a guy named Sanders in Canada who told Booth to do it. I don't see how they could walk away from the series and not believe that. And that's where it lost me in terms of I understand we have to, be artistic, take artistic license and these details, and maybe we can't focus on Booth so much because he is the bad guy. And, what message are we saying if our whole series is really focused on him the entire time? I understand that, but we went to conspiracy theoryville in that now, and not to say that there isn't those, flirtations between Booth and the Confederacy, and he was
Yeah.
up there and maybe spoke with Sanders and all those things, and that's all fine. But we went too far to where it is now anyone who sees the show who does not know will be like, oh, Lincoln's assassination was because of a guy named George Sanders who had a cockatiel and was mad about slavery ending. And be like, oh,
And he
he's the
lived
one
in
who did it.
Canada, and now Canada's bad.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's what Darren said too when we were watching it. Like, Darren, I remember you started saying like, "Oh, we're getting into the conspiracy now." Like
Well, that's what it was.
hardcore.
And they're going big thing. Surratt, obviously, there's that scene earlier when he's recruiting Davy before August of '64.
He's like, we have been interested in you. I'm like, who's the we?
And he's kind of like one of these, hey,
yeah,
buddy, you want a job? And it was so again, I'm not going crazy with the time thing, but I guess they introduced John Surratt. I think that was the scene they first introduced him. I could be wrong, but I think that's the scene.
You're right.
But the Canadian stuff, though, and especially after, and it was very interesting the way the whole thing kind of went down, and how his real escape was, which is a really cool story of how he gets over, gets over the Vatican and stuff like that. But how the conspiracy went with double agents and all this stuff, and it just, and I'm watching it thinking, okay, just check the man at the door, your brain at the door, it's going to be okay. But then what they would do is put just enough real history in to pull you back, just to piss you off again.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and I felt bad for Canada because, as you said, it's completely bad. And the one good Canadian, not that one good Canadian, but I'm saying the heroic Canadian in our story doesn't exist. No.
No, yeah, Doherty. Yeah, I was waiting for him, and I'm like, is that him? They
gave us the fake out because they give Colonel Conger Doherty's facial hair, and so the first time I saw him, like, oh look, there's Doherty, and then later we're like, oh no, that's actually Colonel Conger. They completely cut out the Canadian, and I was like, oh, Mary's gonna be mad. They made the one,
I was,
I'm like the one heroic
because he's
Canadian.
he has like I want to say a prominent role in Killing Lincoln, but he is mentioned in the documentary Killing Lincoln, and I just think I don't know, I'm biased because obviously I'm Canadian and I'm quite proud of what he did, and he's buried in Arlington. And I was thinking, oh God, this guy's got to be in this. And I kept waiting. I'm like, where's Doherty? Like,
yep, they just cut him out completely. Poor guy.
Yep. But
yeah, there wasn't too much of the Lincoln Evangel 16th New York with this. It just seemed like as it went on, it went from showing it, expanding it out, where it was like if I don't know, if Eisenschimmel and Finest Bates had a baby and they wrote a book, where it just seemed like they merged all the conspiracy theaters together, and then once Booth is finally killed, they finally get him. We got to talk more about the whole Willie Jett and Bainbridge and Ruggles all out, but that whole scene was interesting too. But after they finally got him, I'm like, wait a second, this is like episode 5, this 70s. What the hell are they going to do now? And then it turned into the conspiracy thing, and it shows Stanton dumping the body in the river like Bin Laden, and so at that point it just became entertaining. But then it went into the whole Reconstruction with Johnson and Sherman and Oliver Otis Howard and that. So it seemed like it really kind of, if they're going to call it Manhunt, end it when the man gets hunted and caught, kind of.
Yeah, kind of like Killing Lincoln. Killing Lincoln went on maybe for 10 minutes after Booth had died to talk about the conspiracy and what happened. And I mean, my only complaint about Killing Lincoln was that there wasn't enough about Mary Surratt and the other conspirators in that show. But this one went a little bit beyond that, which, I mean, in one point I appreciate it. I mean, the portrayal of Sherman was completely like wrong. There's no way he would have been like, oh, hey, I'll get right on. No way.
I also thought he was very accommodating to the African-American preachers, because I'm like, I don't know much about Sherman, but I'm pretty sure his racial attitudes weren't all that great, especially.
No.
Oh, that scene, the guy gets on his knees and he starts praying right in the room. I was like, oh my God, Sherman's gonna haunt the studio that made this one.
He would not have been that accommodating. I mean, I appreciated the fact that they put Oliver Otis Howard in.
I saw your guy. I was like, oh, yeah.
I was so happy about that, and I really liked that they did have him say, he did say Johnson is making things tough for me. Just to kind of give the people viewing it like, okay, yes, this means Reconstruction is not going to go that well. I really appreciated that they did that. But there was like just I was expecting it to end at the conspiracy trial.
Yeah.
And maybe just flesh it out a little bit more.
And I think in my mind, I don't know. Don't know if it's accurate, but in my mind, it seems like the showrunners read and learned about Stanton and wanted to write a show about him and
Yes.
Reconstruction, and that they were working on this and fine-tuning it. And then somewhere along the line, someone at Apple TV or somewhere was like, hey, we have the rights to this very popular New York best time selling book, Manhunt. Call it Manhunt and merge this into it. And I think that is what we ended up with. And I can also understand that this project has been in developmental hell for like 20 years since the book came out in like 2004. And I understand probably the problems with it is that Booth, even though I find him a very compelling figure, it's hard to make a series about the bad guy who has, and not to say there aren't great series about terrible people. Like I'm a big fan of Dexter. Like he was a serial killer and whatnot.
Yeah.
It's a great series, but at the same time, but that is fiction. When you are dealing with a real person and you are dealing with actual like people who have done terrible things, it's very hard for us as a society to see them in anything that may appear sympathetic. Not that I feel like that has to be the case, but even acknowledging their basic humanity, which all of even the worst people in history had, and they had good things about them, that is seen as, sacrilege. Like, how could we ever say anything that isn't bad about Booth or someone who's committed a crime, because we really want to dissociate ourselves with them. We want to make it seem like we could never do this, while really in reality, as we study these terrible people in history, we realize how close they are to their contemporaries, and how we would act in the same circumstances may not be what we wish we would be. And so that is, and when it comes to historical figures and Lincoln, and Darren, you said in the beginning about how Lincoln has just ascended, and rightfully so, as an American saint, that anything that comes close to countering the myth about Lincoln, not that I feel like there's much of a myth, but anything that brings him more human is pushed back on in the Lincoln community. And sometimes it's good, because sometimes Lincoln gets some flack for things that really it doesn't acknowledge his ability to grow and evolve, which he was famous for. But people will look at his older stuff and be like, oh, well, look how racist he is, or look what he did to the Dakota, Indians and stuff like that. And not to say that some of those decisions weren't bad, but he evolved and changed. But there's also the people who put Lincoln on a pedestal. And if you get anywhere close to knocking him down, they will come at you. And I think Booth, and that's why, as you know, because you guys study this as well, it's hard to study Booth and the conspirators and the assassination, because people misconstrue it as an attack on Lincoln. I love Lincoln. Like, I'm an Illinois boy. Like Lincoln is the coolest. I am still interested in Booth and can study him without being a Confederate apologist. But unfortunately, there are those who then ruin it for all of us, who do come out of the woodwork and celebrate Booth Day and other stupid shit because they're happy that Lincoln died. And so it's hard to make a show or a movie that is really, I think maybe Manhunt never could really be made in the way we would want it to, because I don't know if a studio would approve it, because they'd be afraid of any backlash if you're solely focusing on Booth and what he did, because he is the villain.
I would agree with that completely. And I think, the thing I wanted more out of this was, I guess, a little bit what you get with American Brutus, and that is some of the background of the conspirators. To find out that Atzerodt was a father. That is huge. That to me is a big thing with studying this. Is I always tell people George Atzerodt is a father. That's not to condone what he did. That's to kind of humanize the position that he is in, that he is basically like, what do I need to do to provide for my child, kind of thing, which is part of the reason that he's doing this. And that never seems to get mentioned at all.
And also why, when he's arrested, he is one of the few who sings like a canary, because he has someone that he wants to live for, and it doesn't, they use it against him. They, take all the information from him and they still hang him, which not the saying he doesn't deserve punishment for what he did, but it really puts all this in a different light. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, same thing with Davy Harold. Is his historical memory shows him as a dim-witted, slow little psychopath, right? Where he was a pharmacy clerk. I mean, if any damage he had was growing up with all those sisters, we're not gonna lie to you, that's what got him. But I mean, but for the most part, he's somebody, and I think you mentioned a little bit ago, Dave, is the character who played him. It showed him to be more of an enlightening type of guy, where he knew and he was reasonable. They would, he wanted to. I forget what play he wanted Booth to perform for him on the boat.
Oh,
I'm blanking
he
which one.
wanted Edgar
Um,
Allan Poe to be
Edgar Allan
read,
Poe.
and
It
then
was
Booth is like,
Poe.
"Can I say Richard III instead in the
Right,
thicket?" And then
right,
later when they're rowing across,
right,
which I think is a beautiful scene, and
right.
I largely felt when they focused on Booth and Harold, which unfortunately wasn't all that much in the manhunt part. Enjoyed pretty much all of those scenes. I thought they
Yep.
did a good job with them. But as the attention is split so much, and because they don't want to add all these extraneous characters, they cut so much from the manhunt, and their geography is really far off once they get into Virginia, if they're even in Virginia. I have no idea where Stanton rides up to the 16th New York. The real guys are
Yep.
actually in DC when it happens, but I don't know if he's in Maryland. He and his buddies at the end of one episode are like, to Virginia, but they're clearly in Maryland, and
Yeah.
he is never shown crossing any river ever, and yet somehow crosses the Potomac and crosses the Rappahannock. When
Yep.
they get to the one ferry landing at the Rappahannock and they interview Jim Thornton, who's like, "Oh yeah, the day before Booth crossed," they're like, "Okay, men, we're on the track." And instead of crossing the river to chase after him, they go back north. They completely go in the wrong direction. I'm like, oh, but somehow he transports over with his transporter. But yeah, it's just
It's
geography
yeah,
was not a
he's
strong suit in this.
he's all over the place. And that's the other, like, like I've said before with the 16th New York. Like I just wanted Edward Doherty as part of that. That was probably one of the more disappointing things, I think, just because I'm Canadian, I'm quite proud of him. I wanted him to be part of this. Um, but it
I
was
thought they
still,
did a good job with Corbett, though. I will say, as much
oh
as
God,
even
Corbett was
Yeah.
though even though he
creepy.
was brief, I think that was a case where they showed they had the ability to establish a character without spending a lot of time.
Yep.
Yes, it was a little, exaggerated in some of the things, but within his first scene, we understood who Corbett was and what he wanted, which I wish they would have done with the other conspirators, like Mary Surratt.
Yep.
Like they showed they could do it in a short amount of time without being overlong, and I thought Corbett was fantastic. The actor did a great job, and
Yep.
I pointed out he's actually played Booth before. That same guy
Has he?
in a old what was it, a Travel Channel documentary called Lincoln's Last Days. I don't know if it was Travel Channel or if it
Mhm.
was one of the other ones, but it's called Lincoln's Last Days. He played Booth. So he's one of the few actors I know who has played both Booth, and that was more of a documentary, so
Yeah.
he's
Interesting.
reenacting stuff while talking heads are doing it, but he played Booth, and then he comes back now, like, I don't know, almost 10 years later, and he's now Corbett, which I think is a great, bad guy and good guy type of thing. So
That's
and I
awesome.
thought he did a great job too in both of them. So I was like, oh, wonderful.
Yeah, and that's interesting how they did that too. And leading up to that, there's this scene when obviously he runs into the rebels, the Confederate soldiers, and that scene was kind of strange to watch too. I don't know if the way they portrayed Willie Jett, I thought was a little bit different. I thought, and I guess Mortimer Ruggles and Absalom Bainbridge were one of the other guys, but they never even talked about him. Um, but it seemed like they were trying to get through that as quick as they can, so they can start talking about George Sanders and Andrew Johnson's in cahoots and all the stuff. It was like they kind of the whole series should have gone five episodes, and that would have been the end of it.
Hmm.
Mm.
But I think they rushed to get to the end of Booth, so they can talk about the future conspiracy stuff, which I just thought thought that went off the deep end. And at that point, it just became like, okay, it's like taking medicine. Okay, 2 more doses and I'm done. But I
Yeah,
gotta
that was
take it. I have
those
to.
were the episodes where you and I were like, wow, what's happening? Like, like, why, like, where are they going with this, with the trial and all that? It
And
was
I
just,
was I was excited to see the trial because, as you said, in like Killing Lincoln, usually that gets no play at all because it's
yeah,
all about Booth. So the focus is different. And so for this one, yeah, you have Booth not only dying in like episode 5, but like at the beginning, or not episode 5, whatever, like episode 6, but at like the beginning, it isn't like you end the episode on Booth's death. It is like halfway through. And I understand that is to show that this isn't about Booth, that this series is not about Booth. It's never really been about Booth. It's always about something greater. And I didn't like it because they made Booth insignificant to his own story. When they make Sanders the one who's really pulling the strings, and then you have this much greater conflict between Johnson, Stanton, and the future of Reconstruction, which again is a very important subject that needs to be addressed. But when you make those the top things, Booth is irrelevant.
Mhm.
And that's why they could cut all this stuff from the Manhunt, and all it is to show him like just fail, and how it comes to nothing, which as you said, Darren, that scene when all the Confederates are hanging out by the ferry landing, and he finally they catch him that he wasn't really a Confederate veteran, and he's like, well, no, but I was at Ford's Theater on April 14th and I did all these things, and how all the guys are just like, we don't care, because they're all wounded. And the fact that he would even think, I don't even think Booth in his most you know a grandiose state would have looked upon a group of men who are missing arms and legs and eyes and been like, I am a symbol. I am the greatest Confederate of all. I feel like he would have some humility to be like, you lost a leg. I just shot a man. I'm pretty happy with what I did, but maybe I shouldn't go bragging to you. Like, even that was just beyond what Booth was. And as we know, in reality, by the time Booth gets to that spot with Willie Jett and Ruggles and Bainbridge, he is a broken man, because Virginia has not treated him as well as Maryland did, and he is being passed like a hot potato, and he realizes he is not the arriving hero that he thought he would be. And they just had to quickly throw that together, because they cut it out with all the people. We never see Mrs. Cusenberry, we never see Harbin and Baden and Dr. Stewart. We don't see all these Virginian people who refuse to really help him, and so they have to do it there at the ferry landing, and it doesn't land like it should, because it seems to come out of nowhere, and it seems in bad taste even for Booth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they got the Garrett farm scene all screwed up too, and that was another thing when they had. I mean, we were sitting here watching it one night. I'm like, oh my God. I mean, it's it had that whole farmer's daughter feel to it. You know what I mean?
He was so creepy. Booth was so creepy.
It's like
it was
like
weird.
I'm dressing her with her eyes and
as
be
we're
like,
watching it, we're like, wonder what Dave is thinking about this right now.
So he's like, where's my medal? He's like, well, I want my medals or my ribbons or whatever it is, and be like, dude, keep it in your pants. She's bathing you right now. And then he goes, I don't know what you want.
But that scene was kind of like when Newman showed up at the house in Seinfeld, that one episode. It was just kind of like, it was just so wrong.
It was weird.
Wrong. But it was like how can we have to add some kind of sex to this somehow. So let's have Booth, this grandiose guy, have this weird bathing scene with some girl who's probably underage. The whole,
I was like, why is he hitting on her? This is odd. Like, it was so weird.
And then they don't even show any of the actual Garrett, and that's the thing. That's the only Garrett who is shown is that one girl. And there is a Garrett named Julia Garrett. She is and the Garretts had a huge family, like 12 kids. There is a Julia Garrett. She is one of the only children who wasn't there. She grew up with an uncle in a different state, so they couldn't even pick a name that was right. And then they never show any of the Garretts. And I can't even remember right now why he goes into the barn. I think she just tells him go to the barn because my imaginary daddy, who is apparently not here, says you should go there. I'm
so
just
weird.
Like,
and then she says go in the barn and lock the door behind you.
Mm-hmm.
And then she locks the door.
And they like I'm watching this going, oh my! I half expected the 16th New York would have laser guns to shoot him at that point. Stormtroopers.
Up until Stan has that asthma attack at Bowling Green, I was convinced he was going to be there. Like, they had set it up.
That's what
I was just like, I'm like, oh my God, Stan's going to be there. And their one saving grace is like, well, no. I don't even know why, though, because he gets better and rides there and sees Booth's body. So why not? If you're going this far, just have Stan there.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. I'm like,
shoot him himself.
Is he going to be there?
And I mean, Stanton, asthma did get him at the end, but that was kind of a weird situation. Bowling Green, this looks like he's going to collapse him up. If he just died right there, would have been strange too. But after he dies, you have all the issue with the Reconstruction. They got Special Order 15 completely historically wrong. They just
okay. Thank you. That was my big, because I'm not an expert on that, but I'm like, I don't think it worked like this.
So they're sitting down saying everybody is going to get 40 acres and a mule.
It's not how it went.
But Special Order 15 was only for the slaves who were following Sherman on the march to the sea.
Yep.
Okay, because if you study the march, they picked up a bunch of contrabands who started to follow them. Follow, and there's Ebenezer Creek, and there's a bunch of ugly history with that. But the ones who did make it, they said, well, we're going to get Special Order 15. We're going to basically do 40 acres and a mule for the men and women and children who followed Sherman on the march to the sea. But the series made it sound like it was for everybody.
And
They were doing it in Maryland, which I was like,
Right.
I know that's not true.
Yeah, I was like,
I know it happened
"Oh."
in some places, but Maryland wasn't even a Confederate state. How are you going to be seizing property from a Union state to
Yep.
give to the formerly enslaved if it was a Union state the whole time?
Next thing you know, you see Mary Sims. She's working in her garden with their big, property, and obviously, and so there was a lot of stuff. And I think what they would try to do is they would paint with broad strokes and just work the characters into the overall history, and just break off a piece and make it fit. Because Mary never got the land grant.
Yeah, no, of course
obviously.
not. There were no land grants there.
So of course they're going to give it to her. Then they're going to take it away from her because you got to watch it. But
and then she goes back to Dr. Mudd. I'm like, there are so many people living in Charles County. Why would you go back to the man who you already hate and apparently shot and shot your brother? And then like I was like, and you just like defiantly quit, which good on her. But I was concerned because the series is very unclear at the beginning if slavery still exists. They are very like Mary is like, I almost like, why is Mary there? They don't establish that she's a paid servant except in some back like language where John Stroud's like, I wish you would have sold her to me when it could have, but Lincoln ruined that. But that still doesn't make it clear that of course there is no slavery in Maryland.
It's not clear.
Yeah, the whole time I'm like, why are you there? And then when she finally quits, you're like, okay, good. It is establishing she is not a slave. She is a servant. But then she goes back and I'm like, you would find anybody else. You would find anybody else to go work for. Why would you go back to him? But because then you allow to show him being even worse and hear him slapping her around and then allowing her to have that release to say when Stanton gets there, go find the boot. He knows everything. And I understand wanting that release and making her heroic. But at the same time, like realistically, I'm like, she would go anywhere else but there if she had to. She would work for anybody else.
All right. I completely agree. And I thought that was like, I was like, what? Like, I think if I had been watching it as someone that didn't know the history of it, I would have thought she was a slave.
Yeah, absolutely. They make it very unclear until she finally quits and you're like, well, I guess there's no slavery, but they really make it seem like she's still enslaved because why else would she still? And I understand there were people who continued to live with their former masters because they had no other, nothing else, nowhere else to go. And so the idea of giving her a land grant so she could be free and then taking it from her showed the conditions that many people in rural areas who had no family, nothing else, and, were afraid. That's why they did stay. Like the Washingtons, one of them had been enslaved by Dr. Mudd but only for a brief period of time before slavery ended. But he did stay there because that is where his wife had been enslaved with a neighbor. And so they stayed there and continued working for the Mudds because that's what they knew and that's where they had established a family. So that did exist. But the way they did Mary, it doesn't fit that because it's not like she's stuck there because of that reason. They don't give her the fact that she can't go anywhere else because she is very much independent. She doesn't have, her brother, but he doesn't come back to work for Dr. Mudd as far as we know. They show her coming back and begging for her job, but we never even see Milo quit. I don't know what happened to him.
It's all very like, I don't know what happened to him either. I was thinking about that today when I was like taking notes for something. Where did Milo go?
He might be in that little community on her land grant, and so I guess the assumption is that he does quit with her. But then I'm like, does he go back too? Like we kind of just get rid of him. Plus, they mix up the brother because Milo was the younger brother. He was about 14 at the time of the assassination, while it was the older brother, Elsie, who was actually shot by Dr. Mudd. But that one, Elsie escaped a couple months after he was shot in 1863 because he's like, I'm not staying here. That dude just shot me in the leg. And they just kind of mixed Milo and Elsie together and kept him there as well. So a lot of mixing of characters, which I understand you need, but as the historian in me, I'm just like, but you could just have the actual people and tell a story about them.
That's us too.
It's definitely a miniseries where if you went into it with knowing very little, you were probably more better off. Ignorance is bliss, because otherwise, like we said before at the beginning a little while ago, was I got maybe 3 or 4 episodes in when I had that epiphany, when I said, you know what, just stop trying to figure this whole thing out, just sit back and enjoy it, have a bowl of ice cream and just enjoy it and take it for what it is, just like the astronaut with Star Wars, just sit back and do it. And I found it to be quite healthy to do that because with the Special Order 15, with the thing with the connections made with the Confederacy and Johnson trying to play itself out. There's that scene where initially Johnson's maybe okay with the land grants and but they forget the fact that he vetoed every federal grant leading to the black codes afterwards. So they kind of,
Oh, he made life so hard for Howard and all the freedmen. Like, just that warrants a whole episode. How hard he
Yeah, you
made
should do
life
one about
for
that.
them.
I did notice when I was going through the online stuff trying to get the actors' names, it said Manhunt season 1, which maybe there's going to be a season 2.
But they killed their hero. Stanton's dead.
Yeah, Stan's dead at the end.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. I think, like I said, with this whole thing is anytime you can really get a good entertainment value that's kind of based on history. Even the movie Gettysburg is just a bromance movie set around a war. That's all it is.
Yeah.
So you can't get too in deep with the stuff. If you really want to get the real nuts and bolts, the X's and O's, you're going to read Kaufman. You're gonna read some books like that. Because as his books, even Bishop's book is dated now. When you look back, I mean, when that first came out, I mean, it was before my time, but still, that was gospel, right? And before all the other stuff, all the Bates books came out, and all the other stuff came out, that really took off a different thing. But again, when you see something like this, you appreciate, I guess, the things we appreciated: the cinematography, the lighting, some of the actors. The guy who played Johnson was really, really good.
I like the guy who played Eckert as well. I thought
Eckert was
Damien O'Dare, I think is his name. I was like, he was a standout. I was like, ooh, I mean, I know a little bit about Eckert, but he had a pretty significant role. And as an actor, I was like, I like this guy. Him and Johnson as the evil Johnson. I thought those two actors did a fabulous job. And every time they're on screen, I was watching them. I'm like, I like them.
They did pretty good. I thought Patton Oswalt was okay with Lafayette Baker, because you know why? He plays Patton Oswalt everything he's in. So he's Patton Oswalt, right? So you kind of take it too seriously. You know, I think I kept falling back comparing this movie to The Conspirator, because it's just a natural thing, especially the court scenes. And I thought The Conspirator did a much better job on the court thing, obviously, because it was basically a court movie, is all it really was. But I think the average person, the average high school student, the novice who picks up this thing and watches it is going to come away with the fact exactly what the goal was, that Booth was bad, he was a racist, but Edwin Stanton, why isn't he on Mount Rushmore?
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's going to be the thing. And then when they study more about Stanton, they realize that he was anything from this. He seemed to represent everybody who chased Booth, all in one character, why Doherty didn't have a big role in it, who knows? Even the scene when Booth died was strange.
Yeah, because Doherty, I think, was there for that. And I mean, like I said, I'm biased. I just wanted him to be there. But I also remember, like, in Killing Lincoln, Doherty did play, it was not a huge role, but, when Tom Hanks was narrating it, he mentioned specifically Doherty's name, that he's leading the New York Cavalry and all that. So I think I had that in my head, like, okay, he's going to have a significant role in this.
Or at least be there, even if not significant.
I know, it's like,
he's not even there.
Be there. The guy's buried in Arlington National Cemetery.
Yeah.
I think when it comes down to Anthony Boyle playing Booth, I progressively got more like disappointed in it. I don't know why. I don't know if that's like right to say. I just was like, I'm not really feeling him as Booth. And I think I'm basing that on what I saw Jesse Johnson portray in Killing Lincoln, because he was just, and Darren, you and I have talked about this, he was just so good as Booth. And Anthony Boyle was okay, but there was something about Jesse Johnson that kind of, he captured, I think, who Booth was a little bit more. There was one scene specifically in Killing Lincoln where you could see him going from being like arrogant to all of a sudden like, oh shit, I have done something very, very bad. And his demeanor completely changes in his face. I didn't really pick up on that with Anthony Boyle as much as I did with Jesse Johnson. And that was something I kind of just, that's my own bias that I carried with me throughout this, that I was going in this thinking like, okay, this is how Jesse Johnson played him. How is Anthony Boyle going to do this?
Yeah, it was a different way of doing Booth. And obviously part of it is they're constrained. The actors are constrained based on the writing that they have. And it's not to say that the writing of the show was bad. Like, I've made a lot of critiques, and there were a lot of people who, I mean, do I wish it was more based on the book. Absolutely. Do I wish it was more historic accurate? Yes. But I think if we really look at what is the real story that they wanted to tell, which is about the fate of America and Reconstruction, I thought it was told well. And even though, as you said, Darren, those last two episodes, you're like, we could get rid of them. In our mind, for the Manhunt stuff, yes, but for the real story that they're going for, that is where it really shines. Like I was taking notes as I watched every episode about things that were wrong, but that last episode in particular, I was just like, I'm just gonna watch it now because it's not about being realistic. It's about the drama, and this is the fight for the soul of the country, and about how we fail it, and we know that we fail it, and this is why, it really makes it seem like Johnson is the all evil, but we fail it because there weren't enough people like Stanton in place to keep these measures going. And that is why we have faced what we have, in all the years since. And so it's a valuable story. It's just all based on the perception of, I would have loved it if it was the war secretary or something like that. Don't call it Manhunt and tell that story. I almost feel like they did a disservice to both in that they weren't able to exclusively focus on one or the other. I think all series, if you're saying a season 2, I would have preferred this had been 2 seasons. 1, Manhunt, actual Manhunt, and then 2, Reconstruction. I would have watched the hell out of that because the story about Reconstruction is fascinating and not told at all. And I think they wanted to do it, but they were hamstringed by trying to put these two together, and they just don't. And the timeline makes it impossible to really be truthful about either one.
And they did it too much, and they got characters wrong. Sanders, for example, they did a lot of things that I thought they tried to do too much in such a short amount of time, where it ends up being just a confusing thing. And it almost comes out where it's like the average person going to say, well, Stanton didn't die of the asthma. Maybe the world would be better off today, type thing. And they make him into weird. And he did a lot of good things. If you study Stanton, he did good things. He did bad things like everything else. There's no question about that. I mean, the situation of people argue about the military trial, and they talk about that whole thing. And people can argue one way or the other about that whole thing, but it was clear that if you studied the actual trial, none of those people were getting off. It was. I mean, none of the.
They make that clear. I think they did a good job with that, where Stanton is almost telling Joseph Holt, he's like, "You're going to get me guilty verdicts," and even Holt is like, "I don't know if it works that way," and he's like, "You're going to get me guilty verdicts," something like that. I thought they played enough to show, as much a hero as Stan is in this story. They did show, and they really, and I guess I have to ask you two, because I'll be honest, my knowledge of the Dahlgren affair is not as developed as it should be, and you guys are the experts on everything. So that flashback scene was interesting because they really make it seem like Lincoln is behind the Dahlgren orders and that Stanton is protecting him somewhat. He's like, just get it done. I don't want to know how it's done, but get it done.
Ulrich Dahlgren was a cavalry raider, and he was basically just causing all kinds of problems, just trying to get into Virginia. Young guy, his father was a famous Navy guy in the Confederate United States Navy, and he ends up crossing at nighttime, ends up getting shot and killed, and all his men run away and leave him to die. On his body, they find a piece of paper that basically says, kill the president and kill the Confederate Congress. And it ends up being a big deal. They strip his body naked. They put him in a store window for a couple of days. They make a mockery out of him. And it ends up being a lot of repercussions being sent back, where you have the feeder blankets being sent to the White House, and it was kind
of Black Flag warfare.
Warfare. And they really focus on that. And whether or not Stantz was behind it or not, it's one of those mysteries. Personally, I don't think it was. I think it was Dahlgren just trying to be more important than he really, really was. Whether he thought he was a John Mosby or a Nathan Bedford Forrest or one of these guys. But I think.
Do you think the orders were genuine? Because I thought that's the big question, is whether the orders were even real or if they were Confederate propaganda.
I think it was probably more somewhere Confederate propaganda, realistically, because the thing about it is if you were to kill Jeff Davis and you were to kill Judah Benjamin, you were to kill all these people, Alexander Stevens, the enemy was Robert E. Lee at this point. The enemy was Joseph E. Johnson at this point. It wouldn't have made a difference. So I think put it this way, if there was orders to do that, it wouldn't have made any sense, in my opinion. So I think it was more of a situation where he was going to maybe ride into Virginia with these orders, use them to scare the hell out of people, and just make a name for himself. And I think he got killed and the letters got found behind. I think that was very overblown. The Confederates made a really big deal about it, as they should have. But I think it was more of a situation where, like in today's politics, the stupidest little things get blown up over and over and over again. I think Dahlgren was very motivated to do a lot of things. I don't think, first of all, he's going to take his 13, 14 men into Richmond and kill off the entire government either.
Yeah.
I mean, that there's a certain reality about that just like Washington was defended, so was Richmond.
Mm-hmm.
And how this cavalry guy is going to ride in and go and do this, it's not very realistic. So it's likely more propaganda. At that point, you needed to help light the fire again, get the spark going again against the Union, because at that point the war was almost over anyway. But we did a whole episode on the Dahlgren thing. It's a fascinating research when you do it. But I think he did have something on him, but I think it was I think it was very, very overdone to a point where I think they made it into something was really, really what it was. So long answer to a short question, but I think they used that to justify a lot of things later.
Yeah, I mean, I generally avoided it because in the Lincoln assassination field, it's only connected to this. So they brought up I didn't mind that fact that they brought up some of these conspiracy ideas because there are legitimate connections, or these ideas about what is really happening were questions at the time. Stanton, as a man, absolutely believed that Jefferson Davis and the Confederate cabinet was behind Lincoln's death. That was the charging documents at the trial. Wasn't just these people on trial, but Jefferson Davis, George Sanders, all these people. And I think that was his mistake, is that he tried to bring everyone in when the evidence wasn't there, and that's what the trial proves to us. It might justify the punishment for the people who were there, but the other charges, you have people like Sanford Conover, which we didn't really bring up at all, but he is such a bigger character in this series. When he shows up in episode 1, I was like, why? If you're going to exist at all, you exist on the last episode at the trial as just a con man who pops up. But instead, we give him such a fanciful role as this investigator for Baker, which happened, but not until after everything. He was someone that just kind of came down and started being like, pay me money and I'll find you the evidence. And that's what he should have been. But they just made him this double agent figure, which I'm still not sure they really clarified what side he was on, which I guess is the big thing. But it was pretty well established in real life that he was a con man, perjurer, paid people off to say it was the Confederacy because he was being paid to do it. But the series still makes it seem like, is he truthful or not, which seems not useful in the grand scheme.
Oh, he's like a diabolical enigma is what they made him into.
Yeah,
and he's just kind of a bumbling fool who was just on the take from everybody. Just going to take whatever.
Yeah, just taking everybody's money, which is not wrong, but also seems like, if you're trying to make a story that is easy to follow, why are you taking the most complicated aspects of this history and throwing them in when you do not have the time to address them?
Well, that's what
it's going to create more just whatever about it. Sorry, Darren, go ahead.
You ignore Fletcher and you ignore Surratt Tavern, and you throw in the Conover stuff and make it into something that it's really, really, really confusing at the end for the average person. And we study this stuff all the time. Even this, I'm thinking, wait a second, did I have this guy wrong? I'm like, no, I didn't. You double take.
I was confused. Like, I was like, what's going on with some of these people? And the other thing too, the conspiracy was happening in real time too, because on April 17th, when Sherman had to go to Joseph E. Johnston and do the surrender, he had to go with that, he found out that Lincoln had been assassinated. And the person that brought it to him, he said, don't tell anybody, because he was worried his men were going to go absolutely apeshit on, the Confederate soldiers. And he got to Johnson and he said to Johnson, are you behind this? And Johnson's like, no, I don't know. I have no idea. Like that was just the mood when they found out about it, was that conspiracy. And I do sometimes wonder if that show was trying to give the viewer that as well, that there was this kind of like, what is going on as this is all happening.
Yeah, they focused on and like the Confederate cipher. There was such a big deal that you have Eckert, the whole series is trying to decode this like Confederate cipher type of
We
thing. But
just have
then
to
it's
look at
just
the
like
post-it note on the bottom. That was
exactly
a
that's
code
exactly
word.
what it was. And it's just like, okay. But even then that kind of turned into nothing. Like they never
Yeah.
really did anything with it. It's like, so why did you make this such a big thing? Other than I just loved in the Surratt Tavern, you have that thing from the office of Jefferson Davis, coded message to John
Yes.
Surratt. And I was just like, okay, sure.
Right.
Great.
No, and they got to bring it down to obviously a very basic level so people can try to. But it has these turns and plot twists and going stuff like that. There wasn't too much about the trial. Like we said, the conspiracy, the nine justices there. There wasn't too much like that. I kind of thought they were going to kind of a real big episode with that. There really wasn't. You didn't really get too many of the courtroom stuff. I don't think. I don't think Mary Surratt's daughter was even in this thing at all.
She wasn't. No.
Which is
How did you
too
guys
bad.
feel about and the actors and actresses and the portrayals of Abraham Lincoln and Mary Lincoln?
Oh, I hated Abraham. Not gonna
Did
lie
you?
to you.
Okay.
Oh, he looked like a high school kid playing Abraham Lincoln in a movie. He kind of had this very flamboyant thing. Well, I'll tell you, sir. It was something about him. And again, Daniel Day-Lewis is going to ruin Lincoln for anybody who comes, and I get that. But he looked like just a guy on Halloween dressing up as Lincoln, acting like Lincoln, being very demonstrative and very, and he was really good in that movie. That movie we saw, Mary, the
Midnight Mass. He was
Midnight Mass.
Hamish Linklater was amazing in Midnight Mass, which is kind of a horror thriller story on Netflix. I really enjoyed him in that. I did not enjoy him as Lincoln. And it was not like, I mean, I love Daniel Day-Lewis as Lincoln, but I also love Billy Campbell's portrayal in Killing Lincoln as well. I thought he did really well. But Hamish Linklater, like this one kind of, at first I was like, wow, he's really good. And then it just, I don't know, something about it.
He played like every Lincoln stereotype.
Started to
He just did. But I thought Liv Tyler did great with Mary. I thought she did a really good job. I mean, she was not going to be Sally, what's her name either.
Sally Field.
Sally Field, since, but I thought she did a good job. I thought out of the two, she was the better of the two. I thought they just brought Lincoln back at different times, flash forwards, flashbacks, and I thought it was his story is interesting as it is. I just thought that, and again, it's probably because of the Lewis thing, but I thought that he just seemed like he was so over the top, I guess, the best phrase to be, where he was very, flamboyant, loud, out there. But I was not a huge fan of that.
How do you feel about it, Dave?
So I think the big problem for me, and other people have noticed this too, is because Tobias Menzies is so tall, it makes Lincoln look not tall enough when they're next to each other. Because if you're going to be Lincoln, you got to be tall. And Hamish Linklater, as you said, is tall, but because Tobias is so tall, it doesn't make Lincoln look as big as he was, and so that throws you off. And I will say, and I know that the real Lincoln has that backwoodsy like the voice. And of course, I'd rather it be Lincoln 7 years ago. I'd rather him be what Disneyland portrays him or whatever. And so I respect the fact that Hamish tried to be more realistic to his voice. However, I hated it, like his voice, and so, especially at the beginning of every episode when it's like previously on Manhunt.
I know.
I
was
just like, why are you talking? And it was too much. It was just too much trying to go to the woodsy. And then he would change though. There were some scenes where he wasn't so where he was a little bit better, and I was like, okay, it's better. And then the next scene, he'd go back to I'm an old prospector, Lincoln.
It reminds me of that Office episode when they went to Gettysburg and that one guy played Lincoln.
No, when Gabe was Lincoln.
When Gabe was Lincoln, and he was
Mary.
And that's how he was. That's how he was. And
I love your hat, by the way. I see the Dunder Mifflin does Gettysburg.
Yes,
but there it is. But I thought that I thought they could have done a better job with that. But Lincoln, it's strange that an episode, a miniseries about Abraham Lincoln, he's in the back character, but that's of course what he's going to be.
But yeah, like every time I heard him narrating, I was like, oh gosh, like I just want like Daniel Day-Lewis back, or even like Billy Campbell kind of captured. Like he was not cringy at all. I really liked him as Lincoln in a documentary. I thought he was great. this guy, I mean, I loved him in Midnight Mass as the Catholic priest, but this I was like, oh, it's starting to weigh on me heavily. Like, no.
Maybe if they redid this and with the characters from Killing Lincoln, the actors, and put
Oh
them in
God,
this, how
that
it might have
would
been different. You know, Jesse Johnson, that first scene when he walks up to the light post and lights a cigar, that was like, oh my God, he hosed on after that scene.
And
That
he
was a
looked,
great.
and Jesse had the benefit of just looking so much like Booth naturally. And
he
Anthony Boyle
does.
did fine, but didn't really naturally look like the actual Booth.
Yes.
And we, of course, know that as historians. To other people, I thought Anthony Boyle did a good job as Booth. Like, I think
Yeah.
some of the writing, I think he cried way too much, or he was a lot more
Yes.
emotional, but it does show, his range and whatnot.
Yeah.
But he didn't blow me away as Booth, but I thought he did well. I was
Hmm.
happy with his performance. And I agree that I thought Lily Taylor as Mary Lincoln did a wonderful job. And it was just interesting, I'm glad that Mary is more sympathetic in this, or is less,
Yeah.
so much has been influenced by Herndon and just how he hated the woman and that,
Yeah.
she's in her later madness and whatnot. But this also, in some ways, was an overcorrection, the same way I feel like that happens a lot in this, that you have Mudd, who has gone from overcorrected to he's too evil, so to speak. Even Stanton, I think Stanton was too nice. Even like, I'm sorry, Stanton is in height aside, but still, he's a short, gruff man. I know Frederick
He's
Douglass.
angry.
Yeah, Frederick Douglass was like, patience or like courtesy is not a sin that the Secretary of War has, like when he met with him. And yet you get so invested in Tobias Menzies Stanton because he's a very personable man. But I'm like, the real Stanton was just like gruff and like, get out of my office type of thing. And so it's not the beard that really threw me with Menzies' portrayal, but just that Stanton was just too nice overall. And I will say, even though I thought he did a good job, I know he's a British actor, and so the accent I thought he did a good job, but still, I don't know if it's the way in which this actor normally, I haven't seen him in much, if it's the way he normally acts, but he was always talking out of the side of his mouth, Stanton, and always biting his lip. And I don't know if that's just what the actor does or what he decided to choose for this character, but it was distracting to me when he wouldn't say much and you'd be like, search every chicken coop and everything you see until you find Booth. And I was just like, I don't understand why we're making that choice.
Yes, I would agree.
It definitely had its tough moments. It certainly did. But I think to your point, you're absolutely right, though. I think it used the Manhunt story to tell the bigger picture of Reconstruction. And it did a pretty good job. Because I think most people who study history realize that the Lincoln assassination, what Booth really did, is he robbed history of true Reconstruction, is what it did. It's like a bone breaks and it doesn't heal right. And now we're still walking on this broken bone 150 years later, 160 years later. And I think that's in the big picture, they did a pretty good job of that, explaining that. But in the small picture, there were just so many too many little side conspiracies, so many little stories, the historical errors that are made here and there. I mean, it was throughout it. Unless you're a really boothy nerd, you're gonna miss most of it, and that's okay. That's okay. But I think the average person coming out of this is going to have it's not going to give you a intellectual curiosity to study more about it. You're going to watch it and go, yeah, that's what happened. Okay, and you're just going to walk away.
And as long as it inspires people to want to learn more, then it's a benefit. I'm not saying we have all these nitpicks. There's these things that bother me. There are things I dislike immensely about the show. But overall, I liked it. Like it took me a while to get where Darren was, to remove the historian brain, turn it off, and just enjoy it for the popular entertainment, historical fiction that it is. But I think it does tell a good message overall, and definitely worth watching if you're into this history at all. And the people who completely discount it because it's historically accurate, okay, that's a choice, but how does it benefit you to see? Because if anything, this now gives you so when people have questions, where they're getting it from. Like if we ignore it, we don't know where the holes are. And I did, as the series was going on, I did a talk for the volunteers at the Abraham Lincoln Library in Springfield about this so that they could better address the guests who come up and have some misconceptions or things that they've seen and questions about, because that's, what history is. It doesn't matter what necessarily is truthful, it's how we interpret it. And so if you don't know what the zeitgeist is and what people are thinking about certain topics, you can't help make things better if that's your goal. If just knowing the knowledge and refusing to interact with how it's presented elsewhere doesn't benefit history, and you're just shutting it off from more people.
Yeah. Oh, I completely agree. And I come from and Darren's heard this a million times from me. I come from classical studies background in university where I had one professor that hated the movie Gladiator, another that loved it. And I sided with the one that loved it because he said, "Were you entertained?" And we were, my
Are you not entertained?
Yeah, that was it. And he just said, he's like, "It's not historically accurate." And he said, "But you as history students know that it's not. But use that to explain why to people. But if that's what gets them into it, if this is what gets somebody into studying the assassination, to reading Manhunt, to reading American Brutus, and the other books that are out there about the assassination, that's what matters." And as you said, Dave, being able to answer those questions, to know where they're coming from, that if they could be coming from this mini series, well, it's like, or the series, is that why this happened? It's like they know where they're, where to answer them, kind of thing. I enjoyed it. I had to, there were sometimes I had to check my brain at the door and was like, yeah, this is really bad. And, Darren and I are watching it together and it's like, oh my God, is this happening? And, Darren sometimes would be like, this didn't happen this way. But it's like the movie Gettysburg. It's not historically accurate. Neither is Glory.
How dare you? How dare you? That's a great movie.
Yeah, I know. I love Glory. Glory is like
exactly.
one of my top 3 favorite movies. But there's stuff with it,
It's gonna piss off the people at the Mud House. Gonna piss off people at the Players Club. It's going to, but I think the average person watches it. But I agree with Dave. I think it's worth watching and just watch it for the overall big picture of it and get a flavor for the characters. It treated some characters obviously better than others. Harold was treated well, for example. Swan was treated badly, for example. But I think at least they were in it a little bit. It gave you, if anything else, if it gives people the initiative to go take a ride down to Clinton and go to the tavern and do the escape tour, just for that aspect of it, that it's definitely worth it. But like anything else, it's entertainment. You take it for what it is.
And it shows, I think, the difference between kind of more academic historians and compared to like folks like us, who if anything, we are more public historians. Like we like learning about it and we want to teach others. And so academically, yes, I'm like, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. But my role, even though I'm not, we're not fancy public historians, but that is what we do. That's what this podcast is. That's what, the sites we do, the outreach we do, the speeches we give, is because we are excited by this history and we want to teach people about it and get them to understand, more about that. And so this is a huge tool for that, because it's a wide ranging, people are going to come in, they're going to learn it. And it really is a gateway for teaching, because history is really the process of unlearning what you think you know, because we all feel like we know every history. We learn it in school. Like every topic that I have an interest in, when I was young, when I started doing this stuff, I thought I knew everything about it. And then real history is learning that you really don't know anything. And like what we all believe we know is just, you take it for granted that this is truthful. How do you know it's truth? And that's where real historical inquiry begins, is to unlearn everything that you know. And so that's going to happen. This miniseries isn't going to cause any more, fake news or, misconceptions about history than anything else that you're taught, because the reality is always far more complex than you think. Your ego is always like, I know everything, but really you know nothing. And that's when real history is, when you realize, I know nothing. What can I build a real foundation on?
Exactly. And it creates an interest. I mean, I don't know anything about Napoleon. As far as I know, Napoleon's a guy from Bill and Ted. That's all I know about Napoleon. Okay. Right. And so we watched Napoleon, and a lot of people on social media were like, well, that was wrong, that was wrong, that was wrong. I'm like, oh, I didn't know it was wrong.
I liked it.
So, and I think that is the same premise as this, is you can watch and entertain and be entertained by it and not worry about, you're not going to be watching this movie and then go and doing a speech at the Lincoln Library. You're just not going to. But
there will be the people who will learn more. Like, I didn't know anything about Hamilton, but I saw that musical, and on the train ride back home, I was reading everything I could about Hamilton. What's the truth? I was interested. What is real? What is fake? And whatnot. And it inspires that. Or like when the John Adams miniseries came out in 2008. That is such a good miniseries. I don't want to know what's historically inaccurate about it, because it's great. I don't care. And I'm sure there are Revolutionary War historians who are just like, everything is wrong. And I'll be like, but the message is great, and getting a sense of of who these characters are.
That
And that's
got
why I
me
walk away.
so into John
Yeah.
Adams. I had a quote from him on my grad cap, a quote from his wife, and a quote from Thomas Jefferson.
That's awesome. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
That's why. Like
we watched John Adams a few weeks ago, and then she was all excited. We had to go to Peacefield because his house is right up the street from where we are here.
Oh, that's cool.
We went up there and checked that out. So, although my Red War friends say that John Adams was pretty tight overall.
Oh, that's good.
So,
that's good. I still will enjoy it, even if they told me it was terrible. I'll be like, but it's such a good story.
It's so
and
good.
Paul Giamatti does such a good job.
Paul Giamatti.
So
Paul
good.
Giamatti's the absolute best, you know. But I think that's pretty good. But I think we could probably drop it up here. I think we've done this. We've done this quite a bit. So, but I think overall, I mean, if we're doing the old Siskel and Ebert thumbs up, thumbs down thing, I don't know. I mean, I think
I liked it.
But John just point. I mean, we was talking with John Wilkes Booth, but Dave's point is right on. If you're someone who studies this and knows this in all the time, then you're not going to like it. But if you're watching it in entertainment and you're seeing the Secretary of War jumping building to building, measuring footprints and finding secret rooms, then hell yeah, Batman. That sounds pretty cool. Yeah, that's pretty good. So I mean, I think it's the eye of the beholder, but it's entertaining. I enjoyed it. I may watch it again just to go through it a second time without the cynical eye, without the watching it from the beginning, with sitting there going, oh, this, you know, and poor Mary to listen to me bitch about this thing, but I think it's me too. But I think if you just go through and watch it, entertaining. But I will find your blog. I didn't read any of your stuff before this because I wanted to go and clean with this whole thing. Because I think you and I think the same with this almost exactly.
It's funny. Some of the things you said, it's almost word for word what I've written. And I knew that Darren, you and I have a very same, like similar look at things. So you were saying certain things. I'm like, I wrote that exact. You're going to think I just like ripped it all off from you because it is the same.
No. It's some of the, but the blatant stuff is, if you study, I mean, you know, you and I have been riding the rails with the Lincoln thing for years and years and years. So a lot of this stuff is kind of, you know, common stuff. But yeah, but it's I think if we got together with a handful of people, Michael Kaufman or, you know, Kate Larson, we all have the same opinions. Any of the Booth people will. So I think that's so it's fascinating. I had a feeling that some of the stuff would be exactly the same, you know.
Yeah, and I have been working on like historical reviews for each episode, but I mean the series has been out now for a while, and I'm still several episodes behind just because I am trying to make. I'm not trying to, you know, belittle the work that has been done. I think I've been trying my best to be like, these are things that I like about every episode, and there are consistent things. Like I said, I hope this miniseries wins. I don't know if they're up for Emmys or whatever they can get as a streaming thing for like costuming and like set design and some of these things that I think are really, you know, really well done, and I hope it gets the recognition it deserves in a lot of these categories, and that my historical reviews are really to point out the things that are wrong, not as a dig to the showrunners and the writers who made different choices, but just so that people who are interested, like I am, can then look up, all right, this is what happened, how realistic is this to what actually, and so it's just taking me a long time because even though I really like the series, historically speaking, we know, as you've heard from the last 2 hours almost, there's a lot of things that they just took artistic license with instead to tell the story they wanted to tell instead of the story as we actually know it. And it just takes a long time to go through all that. So I still have like 2 more episodes or 3 more episodes I need to do just because it takes a long time.
No, and just in short, like I've read some, like a few of the reviews you've done,
and they're pages and pages long.
They are. They've been excellent.
They're like books.
They've been excellent though, and we'll share your blog on our Facebook page so our listeners know about it. We've shared it on our YouTube live streams that we've done too when we've talked about this as well.
You guys are great.
Thank you, and
thank you
for joining us. For this.
Anytime you want to talk about Booth stuff, I'm here for it.
Oh yes.
No, absolutely. We look forward to always have you on. As soon as we knew this thing was coming up, we got to get Dave on because this is going to be awesome.
Yeah, that's the first thing. Was like, okay, well, we have to tell.
Because I said it's either going to be brilliant. We're going to be sitting down drinking champagne, saying how great it was, or we were just going to.
We were like, oh my god!
And then about 10 minutes in, I'm like, oh, this is going to be.
Well, it's interesting how it ended up being both, because I think that's kind of our wide thing. Is like in some ways. It's not what we expected and not what we had hoped as historians, but as people who appreciate the larger story of Reconstruction and what they're going for, we like it, which is almost contradictory because I do like the series a lot, and at the same time I dislike it a lot in certain things too. And it's a weird dichotomy, but it's there, and that's, you know, entertainment for you, that it 2 parts of our brains, and that's how we can look at it and be like, well, all of this is wrong. There's a lot of things wrong, but it is successful because the overall message is a good one, and I think it is well acted and well designed, and that I can overlook all the bad history because the greater idea is there, and that if it had failed that, we would be trashing this and not saying anything good about it because there would be nothing holding it up. But it is a worthwhile series, even though it's historical fantasy, even more than fiction at times, but it's still good in what it's trying to do.
I completely agree with that. But
No,
it's
absolutely. I think that's a perfect way to describe it. I hope people watch it. I hope people realize. I think I hope people will watch this and go.
And then season 2 will come.
Season 2, the
and
search for
hopefully
Curly's
Oliver
gold.
Otis Howard will be like a character in it.
Yeah, they should make an Otis, just a Howard, series all by itself. So you guys need to start pitching that.
Oh God, man, put that.
You would be historical consultants on that. Yeah, get to work.
Oh, that'd be something. My God, but I think you described it perfectly. Hopefully, people will watch this. They'll pick up the Swanson book and they'll read that, and then maybe they get into Kaufman and they go off and off they go. Next thing you know, they're sitting in the pine thicket, overnight trying to stay there and trying to get really into it, because I think it is a fascinating part of history. I think it's the third rail of Civil War history, because to your point, people don't like to study it because it makes you feel uncomfortable. But I think, like we said many times before, and I think it was Chamberlain who said this, is the darkest parts of history shine the most light on the past, right? And I think that's what you have to do. And we've said before, you really can't get a full 360-degree study of Abraham Lincoln without studying John Wilkes Booth, because they're tied, they're connected, they just are. And hopefully this series at least gives someone a spark to study a little bit more. Maybe there's some high school kid watching this thinking, I'm gonna start to research this and go from there. So anyway, I think we did it justice, though. I think overall, I think we'll probably talk more about this than anybody else has online anywhere. So hopefully they appreciate it. But we definitely appreciate having you, though. No question about that.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. This was awesome.
As long as my name isn't Mud, I'll come back anytime.
Yes, yeah. That was actually my grandmother always said to me, like, keep doing that, your name will be Mud. And
really?
That's how I
up in Canada. It was even up there, huh?
Yeah. No, she was big into American history, so that's how it
rubbed off on you, I see.
Yeah, it definitely
and if they do make Manhunt season 2, the search for Curly's gold, we'll have you on. We'll definitely bring you back.
Yeah.
We'll certainly talk about that. So any final words from you there, Mary?
Well, thanks to all our listeners for tuning in with us tonight for episode 129. Thank you, Dave Taylor, for joining us for this. Thank you, Darren, as always, for being the amazing co-host you are with this. And we will be back with you with our next episode. 130 is going to be about General Lew Wallace, which might be a little bit controversial at times. I think we are Team Wallace on here. I mean, even though some of the stuff with the conspiracy trial with him.
I was about to say, I've heard of him.
Yep.
Yeah, he was poor Mary Surratt.
We're talking about we're talking about Lew Wallace next time. So anyway, we're going to be in Gettysburg this weekend for some events and stuff. So stay tuned to our Facebook page for that. But until then, we will see y'all on the other side.
Peace out, everybody.